What if you could, like, tap into a foundational blueprint, for how societies work, how leaders should lead, how core principles shape a whole people?
Hmm.
Well, today we're doing a deep dive into exactly that kind of text, Deuteronomy, from the King James Version of the Bible.
And this book, it really takes us to this crucial moment in history. You have to picture Moses, right, giving these powerful sort of legacy speeches to the Israelites.
Okay.
40 years after they escaped Egypt, they're right there on the edge of the Promised Land, east side of the Jordan River in Moab. It's like a farewell, a recap, and final instructions all rolled into one.
Exactly. So our mission here is to try and distill this really influential work. I mean, it can be dense.
It can be.
We want to pull out the key insights about, leadership, the role of law, that connection between a community and its guiding principles, get the essence of it.
A really significant historical and religious document. Yeah.
So where does this journey, this story, begin in Deuteronomy?
Well, the first few chapters, they actually look back. They provide context by recounting the long road they've already traveled.
Okay.
Moses talks about the journey from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea. Now, geographically, the text says that's an 11-day trip.
11 days. That's it.
Yeah, but it took them 40 years.
40 years. Wow.
And what's really striking is how the text directly links this huge delay to their disobedience. It wasn't just about, getting lost.
Right. So they were basically almost there. The land promised to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob.
Mm-hmm.
And then fear just stopped them.
Exactly. That famous story of the 12 spies they sent out.
Mm-hmm.
They came back with proof of how good the land was. You remember the Valley of Eshcol? The giant fruit they carried back, tangible proof.
Yeah, you could picture it, proof of abundance.
Absolutely. But alongside that great report, there was this wave of anxiety, fear.
What were they afraid of?
The spies talked about giants, about these huge walled cities, and that fear, the text really emphasizes this, it just crushed their faith, even after everything God had already done.
It shows how perspective, how belief, can totally change how you react to the facts, doesn't it?
It really does. And the fallout was huge.
How so?
Well, divine wrath is mentioned. The decree comes down. This generation, the one that let fear win, they won't enter the promised land.
That whole generation.
Yeah, except for Caleb and Joshua. They're singled out for having a different spirit. It's a stark lesson about how a collective mindset can shape a collective fate.
And it wasn't just the people, was it? Moses, too.
Right. Moses himself is also barred from entering. The text attributes it to an instance where the people's actions caused him to mess up.
Wow. That says a lot about leadership, doesn't it? Your fate is tied to the group you lead. High stakes.
Very high stakes. Then there's this fascinating, almost knee-jerk reaction. After refusing to go forward,
Yeah.
they suddenly decide, okay, let's attack anyway.
Oh, no. After being told not to.
Exactly. Talk about bad timing. They swing from paralysis to just rash action, ignoring the command.
And how did that turn out? Let me guess.
Not well. They got totally beaten by the Amorites. It just hammers home that point. Timing, obedience, it's critical. You can't just fix faithlessness with impulsive action later.
Makes sense. So what happened after that defeat? More wandering?
Yep, more wandering in the wilderness. After spending a long time circling Mount Seir, they get a new command. Turn northward.
Okay, a new direction.
And this part includes really specific instructions about dealing with their neighbors, Edom, who are descendants of Esau, and Moab, descendants of Lot.
What were the instructions? What's
interesting is the command not to fight them. Don't even trespass, because those lands were given to them. They were actually told to buy food and water from them.
Buy supplies. That's surprisingly restrained for that era, isn't it? It wasn't just conquer everything in sight.
Not at all. It suggests this divinely mapped out sort of geopolitical situation. The text even mentions the previous inhabitants, the Imims and Horims, and how they were displaced by Edom and Moab.
Ah, drawing a parallel, perhaps, to Israel's own coming situation.
Precisely. It implies this pattern, nations rising and falling. But then the strategy changes again.
Yep.
They are commanded to go up against Sihon, the king of Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan.
And this time?
This time, obedience leads to decisive victory. They take over their lands.
And the descriptions of these battles?
They are quite stark. The text describes the complete destruction of the cities, men, women, children, everything except the livestock and the plunder.
Yeah. That's tough stuff for modern ears.
It is, and it reflects, ancient warfare practices and a different ethical framework. Understanding the context is key here.
Definitely. Were there any other exceptions, like Edom and Moab?
Yes, interestingly, the Ammonites. also descendants of Lot, like the Moabites. They were also not to be offed. It shows a real specificity to these commands.
Okay. So that sets the stage. Then we move into the big legal sections, right? Chapters 4 through 11.
Exactly. This is where Moses really makes his case, passionately urging them to obey the statutes and judgments he's taught them.
And how does he frame that? Why obey?
He argues it's not just rules, it's their wisdom, their understanding. It's what will make them stand out among nations. He keeps pointing back to their unique experience hearing God's voice directly from the fire at Sinai, Horeb, and surviving.
That direct encounter. That must have been foundational for how they saw the law.
Absolutely. It gives it this immense divine authority. And this is where we get that powerful restatement of the core principles.
The 10 Commandments.
Yes. No other gods, no idols, don't misuse God's name, keep the Sabbath, honor parents, and then the prohibitions. No killing, adultery, stealing, false witness, coveting. Delivered straight from the fire and cloud on the mountain. You can see how that becomes the bedrock.
You really can.
Yeah.
But the text also mentions the people were terrified by God's voice.
They were overwhelmed. They actually asked Moses to be the intermediary, the go-between.
Which highlights both the sheer power of the divine, but also maybe the human need for things to be mediated, made accessible.
That's a great way to put it. How do we handle that tension today between ultimate authority and human interpretation? It's still relevant.
Definitely. And after Sinai, there's a huge focus on passing this down, right?
Huge. Moses commands them. Teach these laws diligently. To your children, your grandchildren. Weave them into daily life. Symbolically, bind them on your hands, foreheads, write them on your doorposts.
So it's not just known, it's lived.
Yeah.
Constantly reinforced.
Exactly. The idea is that these principles need active cultivation to survive.
And the payoff? What's the promise if they obey?
Well, the text spells it out clearly. In the Promised Land. Prosperity, growth, abundance. That famous phrase, a land flowing with milk and honey.
A stark contrast to the desert.
A very stark contrast. But, and this is crucial, this promise comes with a big warning.
Which is, don't forget.
Bingo, don't forget God when times are good, when you're comfortable, secure. Don't forget where it came from. He warns about the danger of being drawn to other gods, emphasizing God's jealousy, that demand for exclusive devotion.
That's a timeless warning, isn't it? Success breeding complacency.
It really is. And to drive it home, Moses lists their past failures, all those rebellions in the wilderness.
Like the golden calf.
The golden calf at Horeb, yeah. The complaining at Taberah, testing God at Massa. The craving for meat at Kibroth Hattava. The lack of faith back at Kadesh Barnea.
He lays it all out.
He does, and he highlights his own role in pleading for them, interceding. Even that dramatic moment of smashing the stone tablets after the golden calf incident and then having to remake them.
What does that pattern tell us?
Yeah.
Rebellion, forgiveness, Moses stepping in.
It shows this dynamic, right? Human weakness, divine patience, but often needing that leadership, that mediation. It's their history in miniature. They stray, they get chances to return.
So after all that history, all those warnings, what's the core requirement? What does God actually want from them, according to Moses?
Moses boils it right down. He says, fear the Lord your God, which means deep respect, all walk in his ways, love him, serve him with everything you've got, heart and soul, and keep the commandments.
For God's sake.
Yeah.
For their own good. That's how it's presented. Not arbitrary rules, but the path to a flourishing life together.
And then comes a big choice, the blessings and the curses. Yeah, presented very dramatically. Blessings if you obey, curses if you don't. And these aren't vague threats.
No. How specific?
Incredibly specific. Blessings impact rain, crops, fertility. Curses mean drought, famine, disease, defeat, being scattered among nations. It's detailed. The whole thing is then symbolized by shouting blessings from Mount Gerizim and curses from Mount Ebal, a very visual public commitment.
Wow. Okay, so that sets the stage for the more specific laws in the next section, chapters 12 to 26.
Exactly. Now we get into the nitty-gritty of how their society should work in the Promised Land. And a huge piece is centralizing worship.
Meaning?
Meaning no more setting up altars wherever you feel like it. God will choose one place, and that's where you bring your sacrifices, your tithes.
Why the change? What's the significance of one central place?
Seems like a move for unity, right? To prevent different interpretations or practices from popping up everywhere. It creates a single focus point for the whole nation. And the text says they should rejoice together there. Communal celebration.
Makes sense. And this is tied to rejecting other religions.
Directly tied. They're explicitly told not to worship the way the current inhabitants do. In fact, they're commanded to destroy their sacred sites, their idols, smash them, burn them, erase the names.
All rejection.
Total. And it specifically calls out the practice of child sacrifice as an abomination, a clear line in the sand about values.
A very strong demarcation of identity. No blending, no syncretism.
Exactly. And this vigilance extends inward, too. There are really harsh rules about false prophets or even family members trying to lure you towards other gods.
Asha.
The penalty could be death, even for a whole town that turns to idolatry. It shows how seriously they viewed maintaining that exclusive covenant. Purity of faith was paramount.
That's intense. But there's also social legislation in here too, isn't there? Like the sabbatical year.
Yes, absolutely. Every 7th year, debts between fellow Israelites were to be canceled.
A kind of economic reset button.
You could see it that way. It aimed to prevent permanent poverty cycles within the community and encouraged generosity.
And rules about servants.
Yeah, 6-year limit on service for Hebrew servants. And in the 7th year, they had to be released, not empty-handed, but generously provided for to help them get started again.
That feels quite progressive, ensuring dignity even in servitude.
It reflects a certain value placed on the members of the covenant community. Then you have the 3 major annual feasts. Passover, remembering the Exodus, the Feast of Weeks, celebrating the harvest, and the Feast of Tabernacles, or booths, remembering their time in the wilderness.
And everyone had to show up.
All the men were required to appear at that central sanctuary for these feasts, big communal gatherings, reinforcing their shared history, identity, and dependence on God.
Powerful reminders. What about justice? How is that supposed to work?
Establishment of judges and officers in every town. The mandate, judge fairly, no partiality, no bribes, a cornerstone principle.
Seems essential.
And then rules about sacrifices needing to be unblemished, perfect. And for serious accusations like idolatry, you needed multiple witnesses. Due process.
So, checks and balances within the system. What if a case was too difficult?
It was to be taken to the priests and judges at the central sanctuary. A sort of Supreme Court, you could say.
A clear legal structure, then. Now, didn't it also anticipate them wanting a king later on?
It did, yes. But interestingly, it puts limits on that future king.
Like what?
He shouldn't accumulate too many horses or wives or excessive wealth, things that could lead him astray or consolidate too much power. And crucially, he had to have his own copy of the law and study it constantly.
So even the king is under the law. Leadership accountable to principle.
That's the ideal presented. Then you have things like the cities of refuge.
What were they for?
Places where someone who killed another person accidentally, unintentionally, could flee for safety from blood vengeance. It adds a layer of mercy, distinguishing between murder and manslaughter.
That's a really important distinction. What about warfare? Any rules there?
Yes, quite detailed. Offer peace first to distant cities. If they accept, they become tributaries. If not, then siege. Cities within the Promised Land itself, though, were subject to that harsher, utter destruction command we talked about earlier.
A clear difference in approach.
And even during a siege, there's a rule. Don't cut down fruit trees for siege works. Preserve things needed for life shows a kind of long-term thinking, even in a war.
Interesting details. It keeps going, right? Unsolved murders. Captives.
Yeah, procedures for unsolved murders involving a ritual with a heifer to cleanse the land. Laws about treatment of female captives taken in war, surprisingly detailed rights if an Israelite man married one. Rules about inheritance, protecting the firstborn's rights even if his mother was the hated wife. Dealing with rebellious sons, a communal responsibility.
Wow, it covers so much ground. Daily life stuff, too.
Absolutely. Rules about camp hygiene and holiness, what to do with runaway slaves, interestingly, not returning them to their foreign masters, prohibitions on ritual prostitution, sodomy, laws against charging interest on loans to fellow Israelites, though allowing it for foreigners.
So regulating economic life within the community.
And vows fulfill what you promise, and then laws about gleaning, leaving the edges of fields, and dropped crops for the poor, the orphan, the widow. Practical social welfare built in.
That principle of looking after the vulnerable keeps coming up.
It does. And the ritual of bringing the first fruits to the sanctuary that involved reciting their history, acknowledging God's provision from the time of Jacob in Egypt right up to possessing the land.
A constant reminder of the story.
Exactly. And then the 3-year tithe, specifically set aside for the Levites who had no land, and again, the stranger, the fatherless, the widow. This whole section builds towards that covenant renewal on Mount Nebo, with the curses for specific sins being read out loud, underscoring the weight of it all.
Okay, so that leads us directly into chapter 28, which is famous for the blessings and the curses.
It lays them out in stark, vivid detail. If you diligently obey, the blessings are comprehensive.
Like what?
Exaltation above nations, prosperity everywhere, city, field, family, livestock, storehouses, victory over enemies, being established as God's holy people. Just overwhelming divine favor.
Sounds pretty good. But the flip side.
The flip side is just as detailed and frankly terrifying. If you disobey, you're cursed in all those same areas. Defeat, pestilence, disease, drought, famine, being scattered among nations, oppressed, losing everything, possessions, family, mental anguish, madness.
It gets really dark.
It does. It culminates in the threat of being taken back to Egypt and sold into slavery again. The sheer scope of these curses meant to show the absolute seriousness of breaking the covenant.
No room for ambiguity there. So after laying all that out, how does the book conclude, chapters 29 to 34?
It's a final wrapping up, a final call. Moses starts by reminding them again, 40 years in the wilderness, God provided, even when they didn't understand.
Another history lesson.
A final one. Then he calls everyone present and future generations into this renewed covenant, warning again about turning to other gods, likening the potential devastation to Sodom and Gomorrah.
Intense imagery.
Very. But he also makes a key distinction. Some things are secret, belonging to God. But the revealed law, that's for them, for their children to do. It's accessible, actionable.
Okay, so focus on what's been given.
And then comes maybe the most famous plea. I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life.
Choose life, a direct command.
A passionate urging. Love God, obey God, cling to God that is life. Then he has to tell them he's dying.
His farewell.
Yeah. He's 120. The text notes his strength and sight are still good, but his time is up. He commissions Joshua as the next leader.
Passing the torch.
Right. But reassuring them God will still be with them, leading them into the land. Leadership changes, but the divine presence is constant.
That's a crucial message for them.
Then he gives the Levites instructions. Keep this book of the law beside the Ark of the Covenant, as a witness. He says he knows their rebellious nature, even while he's alive.
A realistic assessment, maybe?
Seems so. He gathers the elders one last time for a final address and a song.
The Song of Moses.
Deuteronomy 32. It's this incredible poem recounting God's faithfulness and Israel's unfaithfulness. It warns of judgment, but also hints at eventual redemption. Uses powerful images, God as their rock, Israel forgetting him.
A summary of their whole story in poetic form.
Exactly. Then his very last act is blessing the individual tribes of Israel, outlining their unique destinies.
And then?
Then he ascends Mount Nebo. God shows him the whole promised land spread out before him, the land he guided them to but won't enter himself. He dies there, in Moab, and the text says God himself buried him. No one knows the exact spot.
Wow. What an ending for such a monumental figure.
It really is. So, wrapping up this whole deep dive into Deuteronomy, what are the big takeaways?
Well, it seems like the absolute importance of obedience to guiding principles just shouts from every page.
Absolutely. And the real-world consequences, good and bad, that flow from sticking to those principles or abandoning them.
And that cycle you mentioned. Testing, failure, but also the chance for renewal, for coming back.
That's definitely a major theme. And, these ideas about leadership, law, community, faithfulness, they still resonate, don't they? They're relevant far beyond their original context.
You really do.
Yeah.
Which brings us to that final thought for you, the listener. Maybe consider the promised lands in your own life or in our society. What role does sticking to your core values play in reaching them?
What are the covenants, the foundational principles that shape your journey?
And are you consciously choosing that path? Moses talked about the path of life and blessing defined by those principles. Something to definitely reflect on.
Indeed.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.